It was November 1950, and American troops were tasting victory in Korea. Snow whipped across the frozen ridges north of the Chongchan River as GIs in thin jackets pushed toward the Yalu, convinced the war was nearly over. General Douglas MacArthur had promised the boys would be home by Christmas. The enemy was broken. Peace was days away. But in a dimly lit room at CIA headquarters in Washington, a dedicated analyst stared at his desk in disbelief. For 2 sleepless days and nights, he had pored over a classified Chinese military signal, intercepted radio traffic painstakingly decoded in the quiet hours. The message was chilling in its clarity. Massive formations of Chinese communist troops, hundreds of thousands strong, had already crossed the Yalu River under the cover of darkness. They were moving south through the frozen hills, hidden by strict radio silence and masterful camouflage. This wasn't a small border force or a handful of volunteers. It was a full-scale army preparing to strike. With his hands steady but his heart racing, the analyst drafted an urgent, top-secret memo. He highlighted every detail, the unit movements, the supply routes, the scale that dwarfed anything MacArthur's headquarters had reported. Hundreds of thousands of American and UN troops were now exposed, advancing blindly into what could become a deadly trap. He sent the warning straight up the chain to the White House. The stakes couldn't be higher. National security, the lives of young American soldiers, and the fragile balance of the early Cold War all hung in the balance. Would anyone in power actually listen? On the ground in Korea, the mood among the troops was optimistic, almost festive. Columns of U.S. Army and Marine units rolled north through icy passes, sharing cigarettes and stories of quick victory. MacArthur's command in Tokyo radiated absolute confidence. His intelligence chief, Major General Charles Willoughby, insisted the few Chinese spotted so far were nothing more than token volunteers protecting their border. Any larger threat, dismissed as impossible. MacArthur himself had flown along the Yalu, personally scouting from the air, and assured everyone that Chinese intervention on a major scale would never happen. His air power alone would crush them if they tried. Yet the CIA analyst back in Washington knew the intercepted signal told a different story. He cross-checked it relentlessly with fresh reports trickling in. Captured Chinese prisoners admitting they belonged to entire field armies that had slipped across the river weeks earlier. Intelligence from neutral diplomats and even public warnings from Chinese leaders like Zhou Enlai echoed the same danger. The numbers were staggering. Over 200,000 troops already in position, with more pouring in. Every new piece of evidence confirmed the signal. The Chinese were not bluffing. They were coiled and ready. He fired off follow-up memos, each more urgent than the last. The Chinese forces were using classic infiltration tactics. Night movements, no radio chatter, blending into the terrain like ghosts. If the American advance continued, those hidden divisions would slam into the stretched, thin UN lines with overwhelming force. The analyst paced the halls at Langley, chain-smoking through the tension, and imagining the young soldiers writing hopeful letters home about turkey dinners and family reunions. How many of those letters would never reach their destinations if this warning was ignored? In the White House, President Harry Truman's top advisors gathered in closed-door sessions, heavy with tension. Truman had met MacArthur at Wake Island in October, where the general had looked him in the eye and promised there was little chance of major Chinese intervention. Secretary of State Dean Acheson and the Joint Chiefs of Staff now weighed the CIA analyst's detailed signal against MacArthur's legendary reputation. To challenge the general risked political fallout and accusations of weakness against communism. The debate dragged on. One side pushed for caution, halt the advance, consolidate positions, verify the intelligence thoroughly. The other side saw the prize too close, a unified democratic Korea that would deliver a crushing blow to Stalin and Mao. The classified Chinese signal sat on the table like a live grenade, its implications crystal clear. Ignore it, and you send American boys straight into catastrophe. Days passed in agonizing silence from the highest levels. Small probing attacks by Chinese patrols began hitting American outposts. quick strikes that vanished into the hills before full daylight. GIS on the line reported an eerie quiet in the mountains, a sense that unseen eyes were watching. But headquarters in Tokyo brushed it aside as minor resistance. Keep pushing north, the orders read. Victory is within reach. The CIA analyst watched the calendar turn, his frustration mounting with every unanswered memo. He knew the Chinese were masters of deception, moving entire armies without modern communications, relying on human runners and iron discipline. Every hour of delay allowed more divisions to dig into the ridges above the American columns. He thought of the Marines and Army infantrymen huddled in foxholes, their breath freezing in the bitter cold, still believing the war was almost won. Then, on the freezing night of November 25th, the trap sprang shut. Thousands of Chinese bugles suddenly shattered the darkness, echoing across the valleys like a demonic chorus. Waves of infantry, hundreds of thousands strong, poured down from the snow-covered ridges in relentless human wave assaults. American units that had been advancing confidently just hours earlier found themselves surrounded, cut off, and fighting desperate close-quarters battles in the snow. The 2nd Infantry Division was mauled. Entire battalions were overrun or forced into chaotic retreats. The casualty reports flooding into Washington were horrifying. Thousands killed, wounded, or missing in the first days alone. Further east at the Chosin Reservoir, Marines faced their own nightmare against overwhelming odds, battling both the enemy and sub-zero temperatures that froze weapons and flesh alike. The signal the CIA analyst had uncovered, the one Truman's advisors had debated and ultimately set aside, had been devastatingly accurate. The massive Chinese buildup it revealed had turned a war of liberation into one of survival. American and UN forces, stretched thin across the peninsula, paid a brutal price in blood on those frozen hills. In the aftermath, the conflict that was supposed to end quickly dragged into years of stalemate. Families across America received the telegrams they dreaded most. Young men who dreamed of Christmas at home instead faced endless fighting, frostbite, and loss. The Korean War claimed tens of thousands more lives before it finally settled into an uneasy armistice. And in a quiet office in Washington, that lone CIA analyst closed the thick file on his desk, stared into the distance, and carried the heavy knowledge of what might have been. Because the most haunting decisions in history are often the ones made in silence. When the warning is loud and clear, the intelligence is solid, but those in power choose not to hear it. In the end, it was American courage and sacrifice that held the line, but the cost of ignoring the signal still echoes today.